Pokemon ROM hacks have been around for a very long time. Ever since Pokemon Brown was uploaded back in 2004, fans have been obsessed with playing and even creating new regions, stories, or even lightly customized versions of the official games. So in this video, I'll be taking you through 20 years of Pokemon ROM hacks by showcasing and reviewing the best ones of each year. But of course, since a lot of these are really old, I will also be giving them a score that determines how worth playing they are in 2025 and beyond. Starting all the way back in 2005, just 1 year after Pokemon Brown, the first ever new region and story hack was released. This is Pokemon Naranja, a hack that takes you through the Orange Islands. Now, I don't really have anything positive to say about this hack. It's filled to the brim with misplaced tiles, terrible grammar, and untranslated text. And while that does make it sound impossible to call it the best released in that year, you have to remember that this was 2005, just 3 years after the release of its base game, Pokemon Ruby. So while even its own existence is quite impressive, I'm going to give it a 5% on the playability scale. It's probably fun if you just want to see how far the scene has come, but other than that, you're better off playing literally anything else. Moving on to 2006, we have Pokemon Liquid Ocean, a game where you play as a Pokemon trainer who just received their first starter, on a journey to collect 8 gym badges. Now, this hack is definitely more polished than the last one, and looks a lot less broken, yet it's still filled to the brim with tons of issues, including terrible grammar, extremely high encounter rates, and the fact that you don't even get Pokeballs until right before you fight the first gym leader. So yeah, it's a bit better than the last hack, but it's still not going to give you any better experience than your average ROM hack released after 2012. I'll give it a 7% on the playability scale, but you have to remember that this hack was released only 2 years after its base game, Fire Red. But I promise that this next hack isn't nearly as bad as the first two, as it's much more playable with a lot less bugs, and I can actually confirm it's completed. But this is Pokemon Shiny Gold, and it's a remake of the Gen 2 games that originally released in 2007, 3 years before the official remakes. It's a pretty faithful remake, but with the updated graphics supported by the Generation 3 games and whatever else came with them. So yeah, it's pretty lackluster, but at least playable and in my experience pretty bug-free. There is also a modern day version called Ultra Shiny Gold Sigma, with updated graphics, Pokemon from future generations, and apparently 3 extra regions. But I did hear from others that those extra regions kinda felt like boss rushes and unnecessary extra content. However, I'm going to be honest that the gameplay felt pretty similar between the two hacks, as enemy trainers had pretty much the same Pokemon, and learn sets still didn't seem to be updated past their awful Generation 3 versions. So I think it's about 25% worth playing. They aren't bad hacks at all, but unless you really strive for that extra content brought in by the multiple regions, I think it's more worth your time playing almost any Johto remake hack. 2008 was actually a pretty good year for the early ROM hacking scene, with a dozen new hacks being released, and even the announcement of some most of us remember to this day. But I decided to give the spotlight to a hack called Pokemon Genesis. Now, for a ROM hack released 17 years ago, its quality kind of took me by surprise. The story is pretty standard, where you receive one of 3 starter Pokemon, and go on a journey throughout a new region to collect all 8 gym badges and become the very best. But it does actually have some substance to it, with reappearing characters and even a couple plot twists. As for the region, it's put together using both default Fire Red tiles, but also numerous custom ones that give the world a lot more life to it, something a lot of ROM hacks in this time period struggled to do. And the maps look pretty good. Nothing felt out of place, and each area actually contrasted the last. But of course, this is still an old ROM hack, so it's no stranger to a handful of bad game design choices, including being forced to fight the first gym leader not even 20 minutes into the game, a plethora of filler trainers with incredibly low-level Pokemon, and the level curve feeling kind of weird at times. But again, it's still very impressive for its time, and certainly deserves this spot. So I'm going to be giving it a 35% on the playability scale. It's nothing crazy or groundbreaking, but I'm sure it'll at least entertain you on a rainy day, and it is playable until the end. Now I'm sure at this point in the video, you're probably a bit tired of each of the ROM hacks being, well, pretty bad. And while that is to be expected for a lot of these older ROM hacks, hearing, yeah, this sucks, but at least it was pretty good 10 years ago, feels kind of lame. So, fortunately for you, this next one is actually pretty good for modern standards. This is Pokemon Azure Horizons, a hack that originally released at the end of 2008 that has been kept alive with various updates as new as 2023. Like you'd expect, the story takes you through a new region with a goal of collecting 8 gym badges. But what separates this hack from all the previous ones is Pokemon from the 4th generation, the physical special split, custom trainer sprites, and a plethora of graphical improvements to both the overworld and various UIs. The gameplay is also pretty fun, thanks to the large early game Pokemon variety and a difficulty level that doesn't feel too easy or too hard. So while it is a pretty basic hack, for modern standards, it holds up very well, and for that reason, I'll be giving it a 60% on the playability scale. It's nice to finally have a hack on this list that doesn't feel like a chore to play through, but trust me, we're only getting started. Because the next hack is one that's actually pretty special to me, and that's because it's the one that originally got me hooked on Pokemon fan projects nearly 15 years ago. But this is Pokemon Sienna, and being the first Fakemon hack that doesn't look or play terribly, it absolutely deserves the spot as the best Pokemon ROM hack of 2010. The main gimmick of the hack is the 100 plus new Pokemon. Most of them look great, some of them look alright, and a few look pretty questionable. But for a ROM hack released that long ago, the number and quality of the new Pokemon are incredibly impressive. What really matters though is that all of them are fun to use, learning useful moves at lower levels, and just the fact that there are so many of them to capture early on. Outside of the Fakemon, the rest of the game is pretty average. The story is your generic Challenge 8 Gym Leaders plot, and the world is put together using a mostly default Fire Red and Leaf Green tiles. But it's still an incredible ROM hack, and it's definitely worth playing just for the Fakemon alone. Not to mention, it's received various updates up until 2018 that knock out a bunch of old issues and bugs that plague most older hacks. So I'm going to be giving it a 70% on the playability scale. If you're a fan of Fakemon and you haven't played it, definitely go and do so. Up next, though, is a ROM hack that many people don't seem to look back on very fondly. However, in a time where nearly every project was a copy-paste story of the mainline games, the creator of this one decided to switch things up. So much so that even with all its flaws, most people still remember it to this day. Of course, that hack would be Pokemon Snakewood. It's a hack that takes place in the Hoenn region that's been invaded by a zombie apocalypse. You'll play as a trainer who wakes up in a destroyed Littleroot town, with no memory of who they were before. With nowhere else to go, you grab a starter and start fighting zombies that wield undead Pokemon. You'll quickly learn about who you are, and then begin your journey across Hoenn to find your brother. Now, I'll be honest, despite its unique plot, the hack has definitely aged very poorly. It keeps the same game mechanics and Pokemon roster as the base game, Pokemon Ruby, so I can't really give it anything above a 30% on the playability scale. The story will do its best to keep you interested, but the gameplay is just very lacking. But in 2012, we saw the completed release of a ROM hack that took the entire community by storm. A hack that I'm sure anyone aware of their existence at the time has played before, and that hack is Pokemon Light Platinum. And if you're living under a rock or just new to Pokemon ROM hacks, then let me explain why it was such a big deal. First of all, Light Platinum had not one, but 2 entirely brand new regions to explore that were put together with with nearly completely custom tiles, overworld NPCs, and trainer sprites. And on your journey throughout them, you'll be able to catch Pokemon from the first 5 generations. While that might not sound very impressive today, most hacks released during this time could barely even add Pokemon from Generation 4. So having both the 4th and 5th generations of Pokemon available was an absolutely massive feat. The world is also just really pretty and really well put together, so much so that even most new region hacks today struggle to compete with Light Platinum's visual appeal. But of course, being almost 15 years old, the project has to have some flaws, and the first would definitely be its plot. Light Platinum follows the story of a brand new Pokemon trainer on a journey to collect all 16 gym badges across 2 regions. And while that sounds cool on paper, it's filled to the brim with an obnoxious number of rivals, and an antagonist group that pretty much just feels like a copy-paste of Team Galactic. Other than that, it's also kind of plagued with some really weird and sometimes game-breaking bugs, like random freezes, and Pokemon's levels jumping up and down upon evolving. But even with those problems, I still think it's something every Pokemon ROM Hack fan should at least play once in their life, so I'm going to be giving it a 70% on the playability scale. It's the kind of project that shouldn't have ever been able to exist back then. Next up, we have yet another Johto remake hack by the name of Liquid Crystal. But what separates this one from the dozens of other Johto hacks released during this time is a little something I like to call polish. First of all, other than the pretty title screen, there are a plethora of graphical improvements. The region is put together using an actual custom tile set, and the battle scene and a few Pokemon sprites have been replaced with either custom or updated ones from the newer generations. So you won't be playing through a Johto that feels a lot like Fire Red and Leaf Green. On the gameplay side, the difficulty has been slightly increased, not to a level that feels like you're playing Radical Red, but just enough that it fixes the region's objectively bad level curve. And since this is a remake of Pokemon Crystal, not Gold and Silver, there are a lot more earlier obtainable Johto Pokemon. But the creator definitely took some liberties with the project by introducing some new characters and plot points that weren't in the original games. Whether or not you like these changes is mostly up for you to decide. But I myself thought they made Johto's normally lackluster story a bit more enjoyable, and I think you will too, especially since one of those changes is the inclusion of the Orange Islands. However, there are still some bugs and bad game design choices that plague the game. So while I am going to give it a 60% on the playability scale, I still think you're better off playing newer Johto remakes like GS Chronicles or Polished Crystal. Now for 2014, we actually have a hack that sits in my top 10 favorite fan projects of all time, and that would be Pokemon Glazed. Similarly to Light Platinum, Pokemon Glazed is an incredibly ambitious ROM hack with 2.5 regions to explore and a total of 20 gym badges to collect. Its tile sets and characters are also mostly custom, something that was still pretty rare for a hack during this time. But unlike Light Platinum, I feel like Glazed was paced a lot better. It wasn't ridiculously easy, as the battles actually had some thought put into them, and I didn't feel like I was reaching level 20 less than 2 hours into the game. The Pokemon variety wasn't just good, it was unique. My early team wasn't my starter, a regional bird, and a bug/rodent, but instead, my starter alongside a poison, steel, electric, and fighting type. If you're wondering why I'm comparing these two games, it's because back in the day, these were the titans of the Pokemon ROM hacking scene. Everyone played them, and everyone talked about how great they were. They shaped the ROM hacking scene into what it is today. But on to what you really care about, is this hack worth playing in 2025? And the answer is absolutely. It's received numerous updates throughout the years, refining the visual and gameplay quality of the hack. Not to mention, it has just so much content. The only thing I think it lacks is the modern quality of life like the EXP and DexNav, but it does still have a lot of features that don't make catching or leveling Pokemon a tedious task. So yeah, 95% worth playing, definitely do so if you haven't. 2015 though was a pretty lackluster year for the scene. Not too many hacks were released, and even the ones that were only had about a few hours of content available. So I decided to give it to Adventure Red, a hack that was released in 2013, but was still receiving a huge number of updates even 2 years later. This hack is basically a reimagining of the original Pokemon Adventures manga as a playable game. You'll play as Red, traveling across the Kanto region, Sevi Islands, and Orange Archipelago, meeting tons of different characters and rivals, while dealing with Team Rocket and other antagonists. I think the story is pretty good, as it's told using tons of cutscenes rather than just walls of text. On the contrary, I have heard from many people that the creator took a lot of liberties adding things that weren't in the original manga, most of which had a negative effect on the story's quality. And even as someone who never read the original manga, I can kind of see what they mean, because there were a lot of things that felt way too strange to be official, even with the wacky nature of the manga series. Another thing that fell flat for me was the gameplay. Other than the story-based encounters, the Pokemon variety is pretty bad, and the difficulty is still as easy as you'd expect a Kanto game to be. So with all that said, I'm going to be giving it a 70% on the playability scale. If you want a game with a really long story, then you'll probably have a good time with it. But if you're someone who prefers gameplay over writing, or just doesn't care about the plot at all, I wouldn't recommend it. Up until this point, almost every hack on this list has had one very big thing in common. And that's a story where you play as a Pokemon trainer with the goal of defeating 8 gym leaders and stopping an evil team. And no matter how different the region, features, or Pokemon might be, sometimes that kind of story can still feel boring. But in 2016, a very unique ROM hack was released that may or may not be the best written one ever created. This is Pokemon Fire Red Rocket Edition. In this hack, you'll play as a brand new grunt of Team Rocket, handed just a measly Rattata as your starter. And while that might sound pretty uninteresting, the way you'll build the rest of your team is really fun and unique, as each time you defeat a trainer, you'll be able to steal one of their Pokemon. The best part about this game though would have to be the story. It takes you through a much darker version of Kanto, showing you the real faces of the characters you thought you were familiar with. It even has some modern features, such as the physical special split, fairy type, and moves up to the 6th generation. It's a really fun and interesting experience, and it's one I think is 90% worth playing. My only complaints would be the lack of any edits to the existing maps, but other than that, it's a very well made ROM hack. 2016 did have one other incredible ROM hack, and it's one I admittedly almost forgot about due to not being a huge fan of it, and that would obviously be Pokemon Prism. It's a very innovative hack of Pokemon Crystal, taking place in a brand new region with Generation 3 and 4 Pokemon, trainer customization, updated graphics, and a post-game with 12 extra gym badges across multiple other regions. Now, despite how good that sounds, and despite how good I still think the game is, I don't have too many positive experiences with it, as I personally found the look of the game to be pretty bland compared to many other and newer Pokemon Crystal hacks, and the post-game feeling like nothing more than just a plethora of extra battles. But even with my complaints and personal opinions, I can't give it anything lower than a 90% on the playability scale. It's one of the most highly praised hacks for a reason. The next 3 years were admittedly pretty dry. It was mostly filled with demos that were later abandoned, and a few lackluster enhancement hacks. but 2017 at least had a nice hack of Pokemon Crystal, called Pokemon Orange. Like the name suggests, the hack takes place in the Orange Archipelago, and during your journey through it, you'll take on the Orange Crew, who are basically the region's gym leaders. I have to say, for a Crystal hack, the world does look pretty nice. And thanks to the mix of both land and sea exploration, it separates itself pretty well from other regions in other ROM hacks. I think the best part about the hack would be the Pokemon side of the gameplay. The variety is absolutely massive, with Pokemon from the first 3 generations, and a handful from Generation 7 as well. You'll have no trouble putting together a well-balanced team very early, no matter what starter you pick, as you'll be able to find grass, fire, and water types on just the first 2 routes, and they're all fun to use with updated learn sets and reusable TMs. The only downside the game has is the lack of really any storytelling, but if that doesn't bother you, then I'd say it's about 80% worth playing. Despite such a content drought, 2018 did see the completed release of what would become one of the most highly praised and well-known ROM hacks in the entire community. Of course, that would be Pokemon Gaia. At its core, it's a pretty simple ROM hack where you travel through a new region with the goal of collecting 8 gym badges. But despite its simplicity, Gaia is an incredibly well-made hack with tons of polish and a complete lack of bugs or really any game design issues. Everything feels well thought out and carefully put together, from the region progression to the level curve and even the Pokemon variety. On the contrary though, I kind of feel like even with that level of polish, its simplicity kind of weighed down my own personal experience, with the maps being mostly made up of default tiles and the story feeling identical to the mainline games. But I do think it deserves a 90% on the playability scale. Like I said before, it's an incredibly well put together ROM hack, and I'm very excited for the eventual 4.0 release that's been teased on the creator's Twitter account. But if you're someone who desires innovation or a good/new story, then it's probably not something you'll enjoy. If you were to ask me what the worst year for Pokemon ROM hacking was, I'd have to say 2019. It felt like there was just a giant pause on new region and story-styled projects, and the GBA difficulty hacking scene was still trying to find its place in the world. However, we did see the release of a ROM hack by one of the most well-known developers in the scene. That hack would be Renegade Platinum. Now, I'm not particularly a fan of difficulty hacks. I think they're for the most part pretty bland, and lack a lot of excitement that exploring a new or edited region brings in. But Renegade Platinum felt different, and I'll explain why as we go. But first, it does have the difficulty hack essentials, which would be every Pokemon up until the game's generation, harder trainer battles, and reworked Pokemon. But what actually separates this hack from others is the way the creator went about doing all of these things. The battles are definitely harder than the mainline games, as you won't be able to just walk into gyms or other boss fights with your over-leveled starter and wipe the floor with them, as they've been equipped with more Pokemon that possess tons of coverage moves. But you yourself also get access to nearly the same amount of powerful Pokemon and attacks incredibly early. And it's not the same kind of difficulty you would find in hacks like Run and Bun or Emerald Kaizo, as I found myself barely swapping out any team members unless they seriously sucked against a certain boss fight. But Renegade Platinum also comes with some extra fun features that kind of surprised me, such as the Fairy type, infinite TMs, and even an extra patch that increases the base game speed to a whopping 60 frames per second, twice as much as before. There's even an extra mod for the game that adds following Pokemon, something that in my opinion has no downsides to playing with. Renegade Platinum is one of the best difficulty hacks ever made. It's incredibly polished, and feels like it was made for the player's enjoyment rather than their frustration. 2020. This was a big year for the scene, where we saw the release of a ton of incredible Pokemon ROM hacks, including, but not limited to, Radical Red, Soars, Dreams, Fool's Gold, and Open World Emerald. Tons of new hacks were being released and announced, and tons of new breakthroughs in the scene were being made, but there was one in particular that saw its completed release this year. A hack that many people, including myself, would consider the best Pokemon ROM hack ever made, and that would be Pokemon Unbound. Now, I have talked about why I think of it so highly in another video, but it basically has just about everything you'd want in a Pokemon game. It has a huge roster from the first 7 generations, a plethora of quality of life features such as the EXP All, Dex Nav, and Auto Run. There are 4 different difficulty modes, and multiple other game modes, supporting all styles of play, character customization, updated graphics, and a brand new region and story. It's the type of ROM hack where if you told someone even 5 years earlier about all its features, they'd probably call you insane for even considering it possible. And to top it all off, when everyone thought it couldn't get any better, just 1 year later, it received a brand new update with even more features and content. If I had to say anything somewhat negative about the hack, I'd probably admit that the story didn't feel very groundbreaking, and the overworld graphics didn't feel like they fit very well onto the GBA. But other than that, it's just such a well-made ROM hack, and it's something that every fan of the Pokemon series should at least give a try. 2021 was a bit slower of a year, but that honestly didn't seem to be that big of a problem, with just how much was released in the year prior. But we did see a few new interesting ROM hacks, one of which being Black and White 3. Now, this hack is pretty unique, as it combines the concept of a demake hack, which is basically remaking a future region on older hardware, while also being a fan-made sequel to the Unova games. This hack, of course, takes place in the Unova region, with the map being based on that of Black and White 2. But rather than starting at the bottom of the region like the original games, you start at the top, in Humilao City, and kind of work your way through the region backwards, with new and returning gym leaders. Of course, it doesn't live up to Unova's beauty perfectly, due to the limitations of Pokemon Crystal, but for a Gen 2 ROM hack, the maps actually look pretty good. Onto the Pokemon side of the gameplay, it shares a deck similar to that of Black and White 2, so the Pokemon variety is pretty good, as I found myself with a full team of different types of Pokemon before even reaching the second gym. The hack's mechanics have also been updated to the 5th generation, with new moves, the physical special split, and reusable TMs. It's a very charming hack that's very impressive for the base game it's built on, and the only issues I had with it was the level curve feeling a bit out of your favor for most of the early game. So I'm going to be giving it an 85% on the playability scale. If you're a fan of difficulty hacks, then you probably enjoyed the heck out of 2022, because there was seemingly a new one popping up every week, and that was mostly thanks to the success of Radical Red and Inclement Emerald. But if you aren't, then you probably hated this year, because that was just about all that was being released. I don't even think there was a single new region or story hack released this year. It got to the point where the main ROM hacking forum on Poke Community was filled with enhancement and difficulty hacks, despite there being a dedicated separate subforum for those types of hacks. But when we thought all hope was lost, a new project was released in August of 2022 that basically invented an entire new genre of ROM hacking. That hack would be Pokemon Emerald Rogue, a Pokemon roguelike inspired by the Generation 3 games. You won't be traveling through a new region or progressing through a new story. Instead, you'll pick a starter and begin your first of many runs. Each run is kind of split into different segments, with each one taking you through about a half a dozen routes, with different Pokemon, items, and trainers. And at the end of each segment, you'll fight a random gym leader. Each run should take you about 3 to 4 hours to complete, and as you progress through the game, you'll unlock new side quests to spice up the runs, and a currency that lets you upgrade the hub with new features like move tutors, mover learners, and the ability to pick a new starter each run. But what makes the game so fun is just how quickly paced and diverse each run can be. The routes are filled to the brim with Pokemon from all 9 generations. Each time you win a battle, your entire team will level up, putting them all on par with one another. On top of all that, there are a ton of different difficulty and customization settings to truly create your own perfect Pokemon roguelite experience. So yeah, Emerald Rogue is an amazing ROM hack that I think is 90% worth playing. But other than that, 2022 was kind of lackluster. And 2023 wasn't much better either. It was still a year filled to the brim with difficulty hacks, and little to no new story hacks. And trust me, I don't want to fault or insult anyone who likes them, and especially those who make them. But it was getting to the point where they just started feeling identical to each other, with just harder battles and extra quality of life, with little to no story or even map changes. But enough with the negativity, because above all else, a new ROM hack was released with the gameplay features that shouldn't have even been possible. Now, I know that's a phrase I throw around a lot, and kind of rightfully so, with just how far the scene has come. But trust me, I really mean it this time, because this hack takes Pokemon Fire Red and recreates it into an auto chess game. This is Pokemon Crown, and as I just described, it takes the turn-based gameplay you're used to and tosses it out the door for a brand new auto chess combat system. You'll start the fight by placing your Pokemon on the field and watching them fight each other. Of course, for this to work, how the Pokemon function with their stats also had to be reworked. Outside the battle system, the world is very beautiful, taking place in a medieval setting. There are a ton of different areas to explore and a ton of different side quests to complete. It's a very technically impressive ROM hack, and I think it's 90% worth playing. But obviously, I can completely understand not wanting to, due to the removal of the turn-based battle system we all know and love. We've arrived in 2024, a year that finally brought us out of the creativity drought that kind of plagued the previous 3 years. But 2024 had a plethora of unique hack releases, from Darkfire's beautiful visuals to Odyssey's unique story and gameplay design. Even enhancement hacks were finally starting to shake things up, with the charm of Emerald Sea Glass and the simple yet effective and thoughtful upgrades of the Recharged series. And while I did put Odyssey at number 1 in my Best of 2024 video, I decided to take a bit less of an opinionated route with this video, and go with a ROM hack released in 2024 in a fully completed state. This is Pokemon Scorched Silver, a hack that takes place 20 years after the events of the original Johto story. So on your adventure, you'll take on new and old gym leaders, as well as a brand new evil team centered around the legendary Pokemon Ho-Oh. The region has also received a fresh coat of paint, with new overworld graphics and even some map changes. But the biggest change would be the entire game focusing on an extended Johto, rather than offering a Kanto post-game. While the lack of a second region might bother some of you, I personally always found multi-region hacks to be pretty disappointing, as the main story barely extends past the first, and then you're basically left with a seemingly pointless boss rush. But with a new Johto comes a ton of new changes, and Pokemon from future generations. There are over 750 of them to capture, spread out very well, giving you the ability to build a full team you like very quickly. And while it lacks the EXP all, Pokemon are very easy to train, with a very well balanced level curve and a trainer to grind easy EXP from at any Pokemon Center. It's a very fun ROM hack, and it's one I think is 95% worth playing. So, after all that, I'm sure one thing that might be on a lot of people's minds is, have we really gotten anywhere? I mean, I won't lie, the Best of 2024 hack looks eerily similar to the Best of 2014, despite there being a 10-year gap in between them. And if that's something you are thinking, I can kind of understand where you're coming from, but also think you're missing the point. We may not have come too far in terms of graphical appeal, well, we kinda have, but I know a lot of people don't think so. but where we have improved is gameplay and polish. Like I described in the earlier segments, old hacks were filled to the brim with bugs and glitches, and even where they did work, there was still awful writing, terrible level curves, and a lack of good Pokemon variety. So I think we have come incredibly far as a community, even to the point where fully custom NDS hacks will finally become a reality in the next couple of years. Always remember that there are real people behind these hacks. Anyways, thank you for watching until the end. I put a lot of time into this video and I'm going to try to release a big one like this every month. Also a thank you to my channel members for their generous support. Again, I don't have much to offer currently, but I am working on some extra rewards for supporters, and I would still, of course, appreciate all the support you'd like to give me. But as always, be sure to subscribe, and of course, have a nice rest of your day.